On a snow-laden Christmas Eve in New York, a man steps out of exile and into a candlelit church, only to find the woman he loves promised to his brother. One glance shatters the quiet. Duty faces desire, pride meets regret, and a secret long-buried strains against its seal. In salons of glittering whispers and streets hushed by winter, a single choice threatens to reorder a powerful family and a tender heart. What do we owe the past, and what do we dare claim for the future? Tell me where you're listening from, and, because you made it to the beginning, what do you love most about period romances? Your answers set the stage. New York City, winter of 1899. Snow fell with such quiet insistence that even the noise of carriage wheels seemed subdued beneath its weight. Gas lamps burned softly along Fifth Avenue, halos of gold shimmering through the flurries. Behind velvet curtains, pianos played carols and laughter swelled over glasses of champagne. But in the streets, the world felt reverent, paused between the dying century and the new one waiting to be born. Matthew Hale stepped down from the carriage that had brought him from the harbour, the fur collar of his overcoat turned up against the cold. After a year in Europe, the sharp air of New York struck him like memory itself, brisk, proud, and unyielding. The city had changed in his absence, its buildings taller, its ambitions louder, but the ache inside him remained the same. He had come home to face what pride had destroyed, though he had not expected the weight of it to settle so swiftly upon his chest. He crossed the marble threshold of his mother's townhouse on Madison Avenue. The scent of beeswax polish and burning cedar met him, familiar and unforgiving. Margaret Hale stood in the foyer, upright as the clock that tolled beside her. Her silver-streaked hair was perfectly coiled, her expression composed, though her eyes betrayed the sharp calculation of a woman who measured affection as carefully as she did accounts. "You have returned," she said simply. "I have," Matthew replied, removing his gloves. "I trust I am not entirely unwelcome." Her gaze softened for a heartbeat, then steadied. "New York welcomes success, my son, but family welcomes honor." He bowed his head slightly. The old wound throbbed. 1 year ago he had left not in triumph, but in disgrace, abandoning the woman who had believed in him most. A rash investment, a foolish quarrel, and the whisper of scandal had driven him across the ocean under the pretense of business. Now, his ventures in Paris had restored his fortune, but not his peace. The drawing room glowed with firelight and gold-trimmed ornaments. His brother, James, stood near the mantel, adjusting the cuff of his dove-grey coat. He turned at the sound of Matthew's step, his face breaking into the serene smile that had always been his shield. "Matthew," he greeted warmly, "we did not expect you until New Year's." "I found I had nothing left to keep me in Europe," Matthew answered, forcing a half-smile. "Besides, it is Christmas Eve. I thought perhaps we might celebrate together, as before." James nodded, his expression gentle. "Indeed. There will be guests later. Friends, colleagues, and the Whitfields." And the name struck like a tremor through the air. Matthew's gloved hand tightened around his hat. "The Whitfields," he repeated slowly. James hesitated, studying his brother. "I had hoped you would hear it from me before the gossip reached you. Arianna and I are engaged. The announcement will be made officially in January." For a long moment the fire hissed and the clock beat its steady rhythm. Matthew's breath left him quietly, like wind slipping beneath a closed door. He had imagined facing his mistakes with humility, perhaps even forgiveness, but not this. Not the gentle, steadfast woman whose refusal had once cut him deeper than scandal, now promised to his own brother. He managed a restrained nod. "My congratulations." James's expression softened with gratitude, unaware of the storm he had unleashed. "She deserves happiness, Matthew. You, of all people, would agree." "Of course," Matthew murmured. "She deserves nothing less." Later, in the privacy of his room, he opened the small trunk that had travelled with him across the Atlantic. Between folded papers lay the letter he had written in Paris, the one he never sent. Ink faded, words cramped and uneven. "Forgive me, Arianna. I left because I was not the man you believed me to be. I thought distance would restore my worth, but it only showed me what I lost." He closed it with a trembling hand and stared into the darkness, listening to the city's muted carols drifting through frosted glass. That evening, he attended the Hale family's Christmas service at St. Bartholomew's Church. The pews glowed beneath candlelight, and the air was fragrant with pine and melted wax. Outside, the snow continued to fall in perfect silence. He entered quietly, and for a moment no one noticed him. Then he saw her. Arianna Whitfield sat among the parishioners, her posture composed, her gloved hands folded upon her lap. She wore a dark green wool dress trimmed with black lace, simple yet dignified, her chestnut hair gathered beneath a modest hat. The candlelight touched her face, and the years of struggle that had hardened her features only deepened her beauty. She turned slightly, perhaps sensing him, and their eyes met across the aisle. The world seemed to contract into that single glance. No music, no voices, only the shock of recognition and the ache of what remained unsaid. She did not smile. Instead, she inclined her head, a gesture of politeness carved from discipline rather than warmth. He returned it with the same quiet grace. When the service ended, Matthew lingered near the door as families passed, exchanging holiday greetings. Snow swept in each time the door opened, mingling cold air with the scent of lilies. He watched as James approached Arianna, offering her his arm. She accepted it with gentle composure, her eyes lowered, her face serene. Yet for a fleeting instant, when she glanced up, her gaze met Matthew's once more. And this time there was something else behind it, not anger, nor affection, but sorrow. He bowed slightly. She inclined her head again. No words passed between them, yet the silence carried the weight of 1,000. As they left the church, the bells began to ring, solemn and bright. The snow deepened along the street, blanketing footprints almost as soon as they were made. Matthew stepped into the cold night alone, the sound of carols fading behind him. Around him, New York glittered like a city reborn, but in his chest there was only the chill of memory, and the knowledge that though a year had changed the world, it had not changed his heart. In the distance, a carriage door closed, and laughter rose into the frosted air. Matthew turned toward the empty street and began to walk, each step echoing softly against the cobblestones. Christmas had returned, and with it, every ghost he had hoped to leave behind. The morning after Christmas dawned over New York with a hush that blanketed the city in a serenity it rarely allowed itself. Snow still clung to the rooftops and window panes like lace left behind by the passing of a dream. The air carried the scent of coal smoke and cinnamon, and the streets, though stirring, had not yet shaken off the reverent quiet of the holy day. Inside the Hale residence, sunlight filtered through sheer curtains and cast long pale stripes over the parlour's damask wallpaper. A gilded clock ticked with quiet authority above the mantel, where fresh pine boughs hung beside red ribbons and sprigs of holly. The remnants of last night's gathering had been cleared with the practiced hands of discreet servants, and yet a trace of tension remained in the silence. James Hale stood at the window with a cup of black tea warming his palm. He watched the street with a sense of stillness that rarely visited him. His was a world of schedules and measured speech, of daily ledgers and predictable outcomes. Arianna brought balance to that world. Or perhaps, he now realized, she simply allowed him to pretend it was balanced. He turned at the sound of soft footsteps and found her entering the parlour in her winter dress of dark navy wool, a book pressed gently to her side. Her chestnut hair had been gathered into a loose chignon, and the morning light picked out the faint sheen of the pearl pin that secured it. "Good morning, Miss Whitfield," he said with a small, fond smile. "Or should I say, Arianna?" She curtsied slightly, graceful even in the smallest motion. "Good morning, James. Your mother asked me to look over the children's donation list again, Some of the names were smudged. He nodded and gestured toward the escritoire. "Of course. You are always so precise." She smiled in return, and yet he noted how her smile stopped just short of her eyes. There was no bitterness, only fatigue, a fatigue she wore like a garment she could not remove. He told himself it was the weight of responsibility, the long days at the school, the debts she still managed quietly behind the scenes. But even as he admired her composure, a voice inside him whispered that it was something else. Margaret Hale, his mother, entered the room moments later, her presence as poised as ever. She was dressed in a deep, plum morning gown, the lace at her throat fastened with a sapphire brooch, her silver-streaked hair drawn back into its habitual braided crown. She did not speak at first, merely observed the two of them with a curious calm. Her gloved hands rested one atop the other, fingers perfectly still. "I've asked Cook to prepare a light luncheon," she said finally. "Arianna, I imagine you will need to return to the Lower East Side this afternoon." "Yes, ma'am," Arianna replied with a gentle nod. "The children have their annual recital tomorrow. They've worked so hard. I'd promised I would help them rehearse." Margaret's brow lifted by a hair's breadth. "Even on a holiday week?" Arianna's expression did not falter. "Their families will be working. For many of them, this is the only time they are permitted warmth, light, and music in the same room." Margaret did not reply immediately. Her grey eyes rested on the younger woman with the same careful scrutiny she had used for decades to assess real estate contracts and family reputations. At length she spoke again, softly, but not kindly. "You are admirable, my dear, selfless, disciplined, but I do wonder, has any of this goodness come at the cost of your own happiness?" James turned his head sharply. "Mother," but Arianna answered before he could intervene. "Happiness, Mrs. Hale, is a sentiment I've learned to hold lightly. It arrives only when invited by peace, and peace, I've found, must be earned." Margaret tilted her head. "How fortunate that you find peace in James." James smiled faintly, but a flicker of something else moved across his features, something like uncertainty. Later that day, after Arianna had left the house to return to her pupils, Matthew stepped out into the city alone. The snow had melted in places, revealing the uneven cobblestones below, and carriages moved more cautiously through the slush. He walked without aim, pulled less by direction than by memory. New York was his home, but it no longer yielded to him as it once had. The streets felt altered, the buildings taller, more severe, or perhaps it was he who had changed. He turned onto a narrow lane not far from the tenement house district, where the air grew colder and the clamour of the upper city faded. The scent of soot and salt mingled with hot bread from a nearby shop. His eye caught the flickering hand-lettered sign of a dry goods merchant. The name was familiar. He stepped inside. A little brass bell rang overhead as he entered. The shop was humble. Crates of tinned goods, bolts of rough cloth, cracked barrels filled with root vegetables. A man in his 60s, with stooped shoulders and a gnarled hand, looked up from behind the counter. "Mr. Hale," the man said, blinking in surprise. "Forgive me, you look just like your father." Matthew stepped forward. "You knew him." "Knew of him," the man said. "But it's your fiancée I know better, Miss Whitfield." Matthew stiffened. "Ah, she comes here once a week, sometimes twice, buys school supplies mostly, chalk, paper scraps, yarn, always pays in coin, never on credit." "I see. She's been doing it since last winter. I offered her a merchant's discount, but she refused. Said every penny must be accounted for." The shopkeeper paused. "She's been repaying her father's debts, quietly, diligently. Some of us had written him off, but she didn't let the shame do the same to her." Matthew's chest tightened. "She never mentioned it," the man chuckled. "She wouldn't. Not her way. That woman's back is straighter than any judge I've seen, and her pride runs deeper than any banker's vault." Matthew left the shop with the sound of the bell still ringing behind him. Outside, the wind bit at his gloves, but he barely noticed it. He saw her in his mind, Arianna at the counter, her gloves worn, her voice steady. He had loved her once for her grace. But what he had missed, what he had failed to see, was her endurance, her quiet refusal to collapse under weight that would have broken most women. She had paid in coin, yes, but more than that, in time, in dignity, in nights spent foregoing heat so others might have fire. He passed a row of children huddled near a window, their cheeks red from cold, their fingers smudged with ink and crumbs. A small girl looked up and smiled at him through the glass, her front teeth missing, her nose pressed to the pane. She wore a scarf too large for her small frame. He wondered if Arianna had wrapped it herself. That evening, back at the Hale home, Matthew remained mostly silent during supper. James discussed plans for a bank expansion. Margaret inquired about the guest list for the New Year's ball. No one noticed that Matthew ate little. He excused himself early and lingered in the hallway, staring at the portrait of their late father. He thought again of Arianna's silence in the church, of her composure. Not coldness. No, it was armor. Not emptiness, but strength. A strength she had never boasted of, one he had never deserved, and now she belonged to James. But in Matthew's chest, where once there had been arrogance, there now bloomed only one thing: awe. And awe, he knew, was dangerous in the heart of a man who still remembered how it felt to be loved by her. The first days of January brought no gentleness to New York. The snow had turned to grey slush along the gutters, and the wind carried the sting of coal smoke and salt from the harbour. Carriages rattled past with muffled wheels, and the grand houses of Madison Avenue seemed to retreat behind their heavy curtains, each family cocooned in its own pursuit of respectability. Arianna Whitfield stood at her classroom window on a late afternoon, when the light had already begun to fade. Her pupils, dozens of small, chapped hands and bright, eager faces, had gone home for the day, leaving behind the scent of chalk and wood polish. A few stray notes from a hymn lingered in the air. She closed her worn lesson book, tying it with a strip of ribbon, and tried not to think of the newspaper folded neatly on her desk. The column had appeared that morning in the Herald. One paragraph, buried between reports of the Astor Ball and a political dinner. Yet the words had spread with quiet speed through the parlours of the city's polite society. It seems certain families are extending remarkable generosity to those of fallen standing. Miss A.W., once burdened by her father's misfortunes, has risen swiftly through connections to more favourable company. Charity indeed begins at home. The implication was cruelly clear. No name was printed in full, but every reader would know precisely who it described. Arianna had read the lines once, no more, and folded the page away with hands that trembled only slightly. There had been pity in the eyes of the servants who brought her tea, surprise in the tone of the postman who handed her letters. But it was the silence that followed that wounded her most, the kind that gathers around a woman whose virtue is quietly questioned. By afternoon, the invitation to Mrs. Langley's charity tea had been rescinded due to unforeseen circumstances. The envelope had arrived half an hour after the paper. Now, as dusk deepened beyond the frosted window panes, Arianna lifted her chin and exhaled slowly. She would not weep. She had wept once before, years ago, when her father's name had first been whispered in the same poisonous tone. She had promised herself it would be the last time. The classroom door creaked open, and James Hale entered with his usual air of controlled composure. Snow dotted the shoulders of his camel overcoat, and he brushed it away as he crossed the room. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, his voice low, his tone already threaded with concern. "There was no need," Arianna replied, turning from the window. "It is only a column read by every hostess in New York," he corrected gently. "This sort of thing doesn't fade by ignoring it." "I am not ignoring it," she said, meeting his gaze. "I'm choosing not to dignify it." James sighed. "Arianna, let me handle this. I know the editor. He'll print a correction if I—" She cut him off with a quiet shake of her head. "No. If a correction comes from you, It will seem like guilt." He frowned, studying her face. "Then what will you do?" "What I must," she said softly. "I will not allow my father's name to be used as amusement for those who have never known ruin, and I will not hide behind yours to silence them." Her calmness unsettled him. She stood before him like a candle whose flame refused to flicker, and for a moment he admired her strength even as it frightened him. "Then promise me," he said at last, "that you'll be careful. These people have long memories. They forgive nothing." "I know," she said. "That is why I must teach them to remember the truth instead." Later that evening, the assembly room of the Hale Bank hosted a charity committee meeting. The event had been arranged weeks prior, a gathering of patrons to discuss the Winter Relief Fund. Arianna arrived precisely on time, dressed not in silk or lace, but in a dark green gown of heavy wool trimmed modestly with velvet. The other women turned to look as she entered, their whispers soft but sharp enough to draw blood. She carried herself as though she heard nothing. The committee chair, Mrs. Langley herself, hesitated before offering a smile too bright to be sincere. "Miss Whitfield," she said, "what an unexpected pleasure. I thought perhaps the weather might have deterred you." Arianna returned her smile with one gentler but truer. "I have found, Mrs. Langley, that whether of skies or of opinion, rarely deters me from my duties." The room fell quiet. Even the scrape of a pen seemed loud. Mrs. Langley blinked once, her rouge paling slightly. Arianna continued before the silence could harden. "I understand there has been some confusion regarding the school's accounting records. If anyone here wishes to see them, they are in perfect order, signed by 2 witnesses and open to any inspection." She looked around the room, her eyes meeting each face without flinching. "As for my father's affairs, I regret to remind you that he has been cleared of wrongdoing by the court, and his debts nearly repaid through my own labor. I'm proud of that labor." Her voice never rose, yet it carried through the hall with unshakable clarity. "I do not ask for pity, only fairness, and perhaps the courtesy to judge a woman not by her father's misfortune, but by the integrity of her own work." There was a pause, a long, measured breath before the balance of power shifted. An older gentleman at the far end of the table cleared his throat. "Well said, Miss Whitfield. If all of New York had such composure, the rest of us could retire our ledgers and sleep easier." Laughter rippled softly through the room, and something in the air changed. The stiffness eased, the whispers died. Mrs. Langley, recovering her voice, nodded briskly and moved on to the next topic on the agenda. When the meeting ended, several attendees, those who had earlier avoided Arianna's gaze, offered their hands, their smiles hesitant but sincere. Respect, hard-won and delicate, began to bloom in that moment. Arianna walked home alone through the falling snow, the cold biting her cheeks, but her step light. For the first time in weeks, her chest did not ache with shame. She had spoken her truth, and the city had heard her. Perhaps it would not last, but tonight she could breathe. She did not notice the man who followed her at a distance, his hat pulled low against the wind. Matthew had not meant to attend the meeting. He had come only to deliver a document to his brother, and had remained when he saw her name on the attendance list. Now, as he watched her walk with quiet purpose through the dim streets, he felt both pride and pain. Pride for the courage she had shown. Pain because he knew it was courage born of loneliness. When she reached the modest schoolhouse on Orchard Street, she turned the key and stepped inside. Matthew lingered outside for a moment, his breath clouding the air, then followed. She was lighting a single oil lamp when she heard his footsteps on the wooden floorboards. The flame flickered, casting long shadows against the walls lined with children's drawings. "Mr. Hale," she said without turning, "you shouldn't be here." "I know," he answered, "and yet here I am." She faced him then, her expression calm but wary. "If you've come to offer sympathy, I do not need it." "Not sympathy," he said softly. "Respect." She hesitated, uncertain. He nodded toward one of the desks near the window, its leg splintered, a child's name carved into the wood. "That's dangerous," he said quietly. "It could collapse under a book's weight." "It's been that way for weeks," she replied. "We haven't the funds to replace it." He removed his gloves and coat without another word, rolling up his sleeves. "Then allow me," she frowned. "I said I do not need your help." "I know," he said again, kneeling beside the desk. "But I am offering it anyway." For a long moment, only the creak of the floor and the faint hiss of the lamp filled the room. She watched him work in silence, the lamplight glinting off the fine lines of his face, the steadiness of his hands. When the wood gave way under pressure, he braced it gently, his movements patient, deliberate. There was something profoundly humble in the act. No grand gesture, no plea for forgiveness, only quiet service. Finally he straightened, brushing the dust from his palms. "It will hold for now," he said. Arianna met his eyes, the air between them trembling with all that remained unspoken. "Why are you doing this?" "Because someone should," he said simply, "and because you have done enough alone." Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. He gathered his coat and gloves, bowing his head slightly before stepping toward the door. When he was gone, she touched the edge of the mended desk, her fingers tracing the smooth line where the wood had splintered. It was not gratitude she felt, nor anger, something deeper, quieter, like the first note of a song too fragile to be named. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the city once more in silence. And in that silence, for the first time, Arianna Whitfield allowed herself to hope that perhaps strength did not mean facing the world entirely alone. The first week of the new year arrived cloaked in brittle cold. The Hudson lay sheathed in frost, and every window pane along Madison Avenue bore the trembling breath of winter. The Hale mansion, so often a theatre of elegance, had grown tense beneath its own chandeliers. Every polished surface reflected not only candlelight, but unease, the kind that crept quietly like frost spreading along glass, invisible until it took hold. Matthew Hale had tried to keep to himself since that evening in the schoolhouse. He rose early, spent long hours at the bank reviewing ledgers for his brother, and returned only when the lamps along the street had burned low. Yet even silence has a pulse, and his presence began to ripple through the house like an unseen current. The servants grew careful in their tone when speaking of Miss Whitfield, and Margaret Hale's glances at her eldest son lengthened, sharp with maternal intuition. Arianna's name was spoken often but lightly, as though it might crumble if uttered too loudly. Still, she was expected at every engagement, and Margaret ensured her appearances were flawlessly timed. If society whispered, the Hale family would drown the whispers in refinement. It was for that reason that the family dinner, a private but formal affair, was arranged for the second Sunday of January. The table was to seat 12, though only half the chairs would be filled. Margaret's aim was not celebration, but control, the restoration of order through ritual. The guest of honor, of course, was Arianna. That evening the dining room shimmered under a cascade of crystal and candlelight. Silverware gleamed. The air carried the scent of roses and roasted pheasant. A fire burned behind the ornate brass grate, its warmth reflected in the polished mahogany paneling. Every detail had been arranged to perfection, yet Margaret sensed something intangible beyond her command. When Arianna entered, conversation faltered. She wore a gown of soft ivory satin, the same her late mother had once worn on her final Christmas. The fabric, though modestly cut, caught the light as if it remembered the moon. A thin ribbon of gold encircled her waist, and her hair, gathered in a loose coil, was held by a single pearl comb. There were no jewels at her throat, only the faint flush of warmth that rose to her cheeks as all eyes turned to her. Matthew stood beside the mantel, a glass of sherry untouched in his hand. He had thought himself prepared, yet her presence struck him like an unexpected chord. There was no vanity in her beauty. It was a quiet, arresting truth, the kind that humbles rather than dazzles. He bowed slightly as she approached. "Miss Whitfield," he said softly. Mr. Hale, she replied, her tone polite but steady. Her gaze did not linger, yet it left an afterglow in his chest. James entered moments later, his manner as composed as ever. He greeted his fiancée with genuine fondness, kissing her gloved hand before turning to his brother. "You're unusually punctual tonight, Matthew," he teased. "Have the clocks in Europe finally trained you?" "Perhaps," Matthew replied with a faint smile. "Or perhaps I've learned not to waste what time remains." James laughed lightly, unaware of the double edge beneath the words. Margaret watched both men with the keen perception of a woman who had witnessed too many unspoken battles disguised as civility. Dinner began. The clink of silver on porcelain filled the air, mingled with polite conversation about banking ventures, shipping routes, and the latest art exhibit at the Academy. Arianna contributed little, speaking only when addressed, her voice low and measured. Yet when she did speak, her words carried thoughtfulness, enough to draw the attention of every man at the table, including those accustomed to ignoring women entirely. "The painting by Mr. Cassatt," she said, "shows a woman reading to her child. It was not the technique that moved me, but the stillness. It is rare in this city to see peace portrayed without sorrow hiding behind it." Matthew's gaze lifted from his plate. Their eyes met across the table for the briefest instant. There it was again, that quiet strength, that ability to find truth in places others would overlook. It was the same quality that had first drawn him to her years ago, though he had mistaken it then for fragility. James nodded approvingly. "Your insight never ceases to surprise me, Arianna. I shall have to take you to the gallery myself next week." She smiled politely, but her fingers tightened slightly around her fork. Matthew saw it. Margaret saw it. The room, however, remained unaware. Halfway through the meal, Margaret turned to her eldest son with the deliberate grace of one who chooses her moment. "Matthew," she said, "you've been most industrious since your return. I hope your stay has given you time to reflect as well as to work." Matthew met her gaze evenly. "It has, Mother. Reflection seems to be New York's favorite pastime these days." "Then reflect wisely," she murmured. "You've walked long enough on foreign soil. Do not mistake restlessness for purpose." The conversation moved on, but her meaning lingered. Do not undo what has been honorably arranged. After dessert, when the guests had retired to the drawing room for brandy and music, Matthew lingered near the dining table, his hands resting on the back of a chair. The faint melody of the piano drifted from the adjoining room. Arianna playing, her fingers barely grazing the keys. The sound was fragile and deliberate, as though she were trying not to disturb the stillness of the night. James stood beside her, one hand resting gently on her wrist as he leaned to whisper something. From across the threshold, Matthew watched as her body stiffened almost imperceptibly. She smiled a moment later, but the smile was thin, practiced, and in her eyes, yes, he saw it clearly now, there was no spark of joy, only a shadow that might have been grief, or something even quieter, resignation. He turned away before he could be caught staring. His pulse had quickened in a way he despised, for it was not born of jealousy but of pity. And pity, he told himself, was a dangerous seed from which love could bloom again. Later that night, after the guests departed and the last carriage wheels had faded into the snow, Matthew found his mother in the study. She sat beside the fire, her spectacles resting on the bridge of her nose as she reviewed correspondence. The faint scent of lavender clung to her sleeve. "You intend to speak, I can see it," she said without looking up. "Best do it now, before I'm too tired to listen." He smiled faintly. "You know me too well." "Too well," she replied. "And that is what worries me." She set her letters aside and met his eyes. "Whatever you are thinking, stop. You are not a man who can afford sentiment, not where family is concerned. You left this house under disgrace once before. Do not return to ruin it anew." Matthew stood silent, hands clasped behind his back. "I do not wish to ruin anything, Mother." "Then distance yourself. James deserves peace. Arianna deserves stability. If you cannot offer either, you must offer absence." Her words struck with the precision of a blade honed by truth. Yet beneath their hardness, he sensed something else. Fear. She feared for him as much as for propriety. He turned toward the fire, watching the flames twist and bend around the logs. "Do you believe a man can change?" he asked softly. "I believe men convince themselves they have," she said, "but change is not in the confession, it is in the restraint." He nodded slowly. "Then perhaps I am learning restraint." She frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," he said quietly, "that I no longer seek to win Arianna. I only wish to deserve the peace she brings to any room she enters. If I can earn that much, it will be more than I ever earned before." Margaret studied him for a long moment. The firelight softened her features, and in that softness he glimpsed the mother she had once been, before grief and ambition had tempered her heart. "Deserving," she said at last, "is a word easily spoken by men who already possess what they envy." He turned to face her fully, his expression calm. "Then I envy not possession, mother, but forgiveness, and that—" His gaze dropped to the fire. "I do not yet possess." When he left the room, the house lay quiet beneath the weight of its own secrets. Upstairs, Arianna stood at her window, her breath fogging the glass as she gazed down at the snow-covered street. In the reflection of the pane, she caught sight of her own face, pale, composed, and unfamiliar. Behind her, James slept in an armchair, exhausted from the evening. She turned toward him, her eyes softening with gratitude, yet distant, as though her thoughts wandered to a place even she could not name. Downstairs, Matthew paused in the hallway, glancing once toward the stairs that led to her floor. He did not move toward them. Instead, he slipped his hands into his coat pockets and stepped outside into the biting wind. The night air cut clean and sharp through him, as if daring him to keep his word. Above, the windows of the Hale mansion glowed faintly, their panes shimmering with reflections of firelight. And within that glow, unseen by both of them, the fine ice that had begun to form beneath the glass continued to spread, slow, soundless, and sure. The city wore its winter like an old memory that refused to fade. Snow fell in slow spirals, soft as lace, muffling the rattle of carriage wheels and the laughter that drifted from shop doors along Broadway. The streets glistened under gaslight, half reflection, half dream. But beneath that beauty, an unease pulsed, a quiet tension that ran beneath every step Arianna took. For days she had felt it, that tremor in the air, a sense that something long buried was stirring toward the light. It came to her first as rumor, then as coincidence, a conversation interrupted when she entered the room, a half-finished phrase from Margaret Hale about Paris and regret, and finally the faint scent of sealing wax that lingered in the parlor where Matthew had left his papers. She tried to push it aside, yet curiosity grew in her like a secret fire, until it burned too brightly to ignore. On a grey afternoon, while helping Margaret sort through correspondence in the Hale library, Arianna's hand brushed a small bundle of letters bound in ribbon. They had been tucked between ledger books, forgotten, or perhaps intentionally hidden. The paper was yellowed, the script unmistakable, Matthew's bold, slanted hand. Her name appeared on one of the envelopes, though it had never reached her. Arianna froze, her pulse beat at her throat. The wax seal had cracked long ago, as if opened and closed too many times by a man who had changed his mind more than once. Against every rule she had ever followed, she unfolded it. Paris, March the 2nd, 1898. My dearest Arianna, there is no word that does not feel too small for what I owe you. You once called me proud, and you were right. But pride is not what carried me across the sea. Shame did. Shame for the man who mistook affection for conquest, who believed he could offer you the world while understanding nothing of your heart. I write this not to ask forgiveness. Forgiveness is a mercy I have not yet earned. I write because I am afraid of returning unchanged, afraid that I will come back to you still unworthy of the way you once looked at me. You taught me that love is not a prize but a discipline. Perhaps someday I will deserve to learn it again. Until then, I will remain what I am, your debtor in all things, your memory in exile. M.H. The words blurred as she read them. They were not elegant, they were raw, unguarded, unlike anything he had ever said aloud. She had believed him proud beyond redemption, yet here was his shame, inked and trembling. It was a confession without expectation, a wound laid bare. For a long time she sat motionless, the fire crackling behind her, the snow tapping against the window like hesitant fingers. Then she folded the letter carefully, as though it might shatter, and slipped it into her coat pocket. That night, after the house had grown silent, she walked to the schoolhouse on Orchard Street. The wind bit at her cheeks, and the hem of her cloak gathered frost as she moved through the drifting snow. She told herself she was only going to think, to breathe, but in truth she was waiting for something she could not name. The lamps were out when she reached the school, but there was movement in the shadows. Someone waiting near the steps. She stopped, her breath forming clouds in the cold. "Miss Whitfield," came his voice, low and calm. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Matthew stepped into the lamplight. Snow dusted his dark hair and the shoulders of his coat, softening the edges of the man he had become. His eyes, grey-blue and clear as winter itself, met hers with quiet steadiness. "I might say the same to you," she answered, clutching the letter in her gloved hand. He studied her for a moment. "You've read it?" "Yes." Her voice wavered despite her effort. "It was never sent." "I had no right to send it," he said gently. "Letters are easy. Facing what one has done is not." "Then why keep it?" she demanded. "Why hide it among ledgers and forgotten papers? Why not destroy it?" "Because it was the only truth I had left," he said. "I wrote it when I was a man with too much money and not enough courage. Destroying it would have been like killing the only honest part of myself." She turned away, the snow crunching under her boots. "You think honesty redeems everything?" "No," he said, "but it redeems something. Even if it's only the silence between two people who once stopped speaking." The wind carried his words into the darkness. She stood for a long while before facing him again. "You speak of shame, of wanting to deserve love, but you never asked what became of me when you left." His gaze softened. "I imagined it every day, and every image shamed me further. Tell me the truth now, if you can bear it." She drew in a breath, her eyes glistening with cold and unshed tears. "I waited. For months I waited. When my father's name fell, when the world I knew burned to ash, I still waited for the sound of your voice. But it never came. I buried my heart, Matthew. I taught myself to live without wanting." The confession hung in the air like frost between them. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough that she could feel the heat of his breath mingling with the chill. "Then I failed twice," he murmured. "Once by leaving, and once by letting you forget how to want." Her throat tightened. "You cannot give back what was taken." "I don't wish to take anything," he said softly. "Only to see you as you are now. Not the woman I hurt, but the one who learned to stand when I could not." For a moment neither spoke. The snow fell heavier, catching in her hair on the dark wool of his coat. A single lamp glowed faintly from the corner of the street, painting them in gold and shadow. "You ask nothing of me?" she said finally. "Nothing," he answered. "Except the truth. Not for me, only for yourself." She looked at him for a long time, her breath trembling. "And if the truth is unkind?" "Then let it be unkind," he said. "It's still yours." The words pierced something inside her. She turned away before he could see the tears that escaped, falling soundless into the snow. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You should go, Matthew." He bowed his head, as if accepting a sentence long overdue. "As you wish." He stepped back into the shadows, his figure dissolving into the falling snow until she could no longer tell where the man ended, and the storm began. Arianna remained there long after he had gone. When she finally turned homeward, Her body shivered, but her mind was aflame. She had expected anger. Instead, she felt a strange, aching clarity, like a wound newly cleaned, still bleeding but clean at last. Later that night, her father found her seated by the hearth, the unopened letter beside her. The light cast a soft halo around her face, highlighting the exhaustion in her eyes. He walked toward her slowly, his cane tapping against the wood. "You've been crying," he said gently. "I'm only tired, Father." He looked at the letter, then back at her. "That's his hand." She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he wrote it in Paris, an apology he never sent." The old man lowered himself into the chair opposite her, his hands folded around the cane's worn handle. "And you believe it?" "I don't know what I believe," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "James offers peace, and I am grateful for it. But when Matthew speaks, something inside me, something I thought had died, awakens. I feel safe with one, but alive with the other. Does that make me cruel?" Mr. Whitfield's eyes softened, filled with the weight of years and regret. "No, my dear, it makes you human. But you must be careful. Safety and love are rarely the same road, and choosing the wrong one can cost you your soul." Arianna lowered her gaze to the fire. "You speak as if you know." "I do," he said quietly. "I married your mother for duty and built a life of silence. She forgave me, but I never forgave myself for what I denied her. Love is not convenience, child. It is courage. The kind you only find once, if you're fortunate." Tears slid down her cheeks, though she made no sound. Her father reached across and placed his hand over hers. His fingers were thin, trembling, but warm. "Do not repeat my mistake," he said. "Do not let fear disguise itself as loyalty. When you stand at the crossroad between what is safe and what is true, choose the truth, even if it breaks you." The fire crackled softly, scattering sparks that rose and vanished into the air. Arianna looked at the letter once more, her name written in his hand, the ink faded, but indelible. Outside, the snow continued to fall over the sleeping city, blanketing every rooftop, every wound, in deceptive purity. Inside, she sat unmoving, the past and the present burning together in the hearth's glow. By the time dawn arrived, the letter was folded again, its edges smoothed by her trembling fingers. She placed it inside a drawer, between her prayer book and her school records, and closed it gently. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was no longer hatred either. And somewhere beyond the frozen windows, beneath the pale awakening sky, Matthew Hale walked alone through the snow, unaware that the letter he once wrote in shame had finally found its reader, and that in finding her, it had changed them both. The first Saturday of the year unfolded with a peculiar brightness, as if the sky itself sought to ease the burdens left behind by winter's solemnity. Snow shimmered across the rooftops of New York like glass dust, and the air, still cold, held the fragile optimism of an afternoon not yet broken. The Hale family's townhouse stood dressed in seasonal splendor, adorned with evergreen garlands laced with ivory ribbon, each candle in the window lit in preparation for the evening's gathering. It was a tradition as old as the bank itself, the annual Christmas concert, delayed slightly this year to accommodate the holiday flurry. Hosted by the Hale family in honor of their employees and their children, the event had always been a gesture of benevolence, part performance, part parade of prestige. This year, however, something unspoken pulsed beneath the festivities, like the tension before a storm. Arianna arrived just before dusk, her coat a dark bottle green, her hat modestly trimmed with black velvet. The concert was held in the grand hall adjacent to the bank's marble offices, a space more often used for shareholders' meetings and formal receptions. But tonight, it had been transformed. Rows of wooden chairs filled the room, facing a small stage adorned with wreaths and flickering lanterns. A piano gleamed beneath the soft light, and to one side stood a table with spiced cider, biscuits, and the careful hospitality of the well-heeled. Arianna had helped coordinate the children's musical program. She moved through the crowd with quiet assurance, adjusting a boy's cravat, smoothing a girl's ribbon, her voice warm and composed. The children adored her, not because she demanded their respect, but because she met them at eye level, spoke to them as if their words mattered. Matthew watched from a distance, standing near the entryway, his hands clasped behind his back. He had not spoken to her since that night in the snow, but something about her posture, the quiet strain in her shoulders, told him she had not forgotten either. James stood beside him, cheerful as ever, greeting employees and their wives with polished charm. He laughed at the appropriate intervals, bowed with precise graciousness, and never once failed to direct every kind word back toward the honor of the Hale family. He was, in every sense, the perfect host. Margaret Hale surveyed the hall from a velvet chair near the piano, her posture ramrod straight. She wore a gown of dark garnet, her hair immaculately pinned, the sapphire brooch at her collar flashing beneath the lantern light. Though her expression was calm, her eyes moved constantly, tracking glances, conversations, the shape of silence itself. She had built her life upon order, and tonight the air hummed with the threat of its unraveling. The concert began just after 6. The children sang with high, clear voices, trembling a little in pitch, but full of honest joy. The piano accompaniment faltered once or twice, but no one minded. Arianna stood at the side of the stage, her hands clasped gently, her face radiant with restrained pride. Even Margaret permitted herself a smile. Then came the final number, a carol sung by 3 of the eldest children, voices interwoven in a melody that echoed like bells. The audience applauded warmly. Arianna stepped forward to thank the children, her voice soft and gracious, just as she turned to invite the audience to enjoy refreshments. That was when the moment fractured. A man stood from the back row, a merchant, familiar to most, known for his tobacco shop near the Bowery. His coat was plain, his expression bitter. "I wonder," he said loudly, "if the Hales extend such warmth to every family, or only to those who bring shame with them." The air stilled. Arianna turned, her face draining of color. "I speak," the man continued, "of Mr. Whitfield, father to this lovely schoolteacher, a man who signed promissory notes he could not honor, a man who borrowed and did not repay." There was a hush of collective discomfort. Someone coughed. A child whispered. Arianna stepped forward, her voice steady. "Sir, I'm afraid this is not the time nor the place for—" "Oh, I think it is," he snapped. "You present yourself as an example to children, Miss Whitfield. Perhaps they should learn how debts are erased by society marriages." Gasps echoed. Margaret's gloved hand gripped the arm of her chair. James moved instinctively, but before he could speak, Matthew stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not glare. Instead, he withdrew from his coat a folded paper, sealed in wax. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, extending it toward the merchant. "It is a receipt, dated, signed, and notarized. The balance your family claimed against Mr. Whitfield was repaid in full 9 months ago. Not by deception, not by marriage, by his daughter, through labor, not scandal." The man hesitated, then snatched the paper. His eyes moved over the page slowly, his face darkening with each line. When he looked up again, the heat of his anger had dulled into something smaller, ashamed. "I hadn't been told," he muttered. "I was told the debt was still—" He faltered, then lowered his head. "I apologize." Arianna did not speak. She stood still, eyes focused on nothing, as the man turned and left the hall. The room remained quiet. Even the children sensed something sacred had passed through it. At last, one child clapped, then another, and then more, until the sound filled the space like a rising tide. Not loud, but sure. She bowed her head in thanks, then quietly exited through the side door into the snow. James found her moments later in the alley behind the hall, where gaslight spilled across cobblestones and shadows hung like tapestries. "Arianna," he said gently, "are you all right?" She turned to him. "Yes, only tired." He stepped closer. his voice quiet. That man's accusations, they were cruel, baseless. But Matthew had the papers. Did you know? She nodded. You've been repaying the debts alone. Her silence was answer enough. James took her hand. You should have told me. I would have helped. I know, she whispered, but you didn't. She met his eyes then, and something in her expression shifted. He searched her face, seeking something, gratitude, affection, anything familiar, but found only a quiet reserve, as if she had built a wall that even kindness could not breach. Arianna, he said slowly, do you still love him? Her lips parted slightly. She said nothing, but the silence between them carried weight, and that weight was truth. James let her hand slip from his. He did not cry, he did not rage, but the wound carved across his face was unmistakable, a fracture beneath glass, invisible until the moment it shattered. Inside, Margaret stood in the now empty hall, gazing at the stage. Her son returned moments later, alone, his face pale. Is it done? She asked. He nodded once. It was never mine to keep. She said nothing, only turned toward the darkened window, where snow fell softly against the glass, and where the family's reflection had begun, quietly, irreversibly, to crack. Snow clung to the windows of the Hale townhouse, as if reluctant to let go. Outside, New York moved forward with the haste of a city that had no time for private griefs. But inside the parlor on the second floor, time had slowed, and the stillness was not peace. It was the pause before something inevitable. Arianna stood near the hearth, her hands folded neatly before her, though her heart beat so loudly she feared it might be heard through the walls. The fire crackled softly behind her, casting warm light over the hem of her gown. It was the same dress she had worn the night James proposed, a soft blue wool trimmed with narrow lace. That night it had felt like safety. Tonight it felt like a memory wrapped around her shoulders. James entered without knocking, as he always had, but he paused longer than usual before speaking. His face bore the calm expression he wore at the bank, calculated gentleness. But beneath it, his eyes searched hers with quiet desperation. Arianna, he said, we need to speak. She nodded, and he closed the door behind him. The soft click echoed more than it should have. He did not approach her right away. Instead, he moved to the window, looking out onto the street below where the gaslights glowed and sleigh bells chimed faintly in the distance. I told Mother we'd make the announcement next week, he said after a pause. The invitations are nearly printed. The gown-maker's deposit has been placed. The organist has been confirmed for St. Bartholomew's. His voice was steady, even pleasant, but it rang hollow, as if he recited a list of things already lost. I see, Arianna murmured. He turned to face her. But none of that matters, not if you've already made your choice. She lowered her gaze. Arianna, he said, stepping toward her, his voice quieter now, almost tender. Tell me the truth. Are you marrying me out of affection or gratitude? Her lips parted, but no words came. Her throat ached, and the silence pressed between them like a weight. James drew in a breath, pain flickering behind his composure. That's answer enough. She looked up then, her eyes brimming, but she did not reach for him. I have tried, she whispered. God knows I have tried to become the woman you deserve. And you are, he said quickly, but you are not the woman who looks at me and forgets the world. Arianna's breath caught. The truth had been spoken, and it was not cruel, but it was final. James stepped back, straightening his shoulders. We'll say the wedding is postponed for private reasons. They'll assume scandal, of course. They always do. But I would rather face scandal than build a marriage on something that isn't love. Tears slid down her cheek, silent and burning. He reached for her hand and held it gently between his. I don't blame you. I think I've always known. She tried to speak, but her voice broke, and he shook his head. You gave me dignity in a world that values only reputation, he said. Let me give you the same. When he left the room, the silence that followed was not empty. It was sacred, carved out by two people who had chosen grace over comfort. By the end of the day, the announcement had been issued through discreet letters, written on heavy cream paper in Margaret's careful hand. Due to unforeseen personal circumstances, the engagement of Mr. James Hale and Miss Arianna Whitfield has been respectfully postponed. Within hours, the whispers began. By the next morning, the city was ablaze with speculation. In parlours and tea shops, voices lowered and widened, eyes blinked with practiced sympathy. She left him, a girl with her father's history? No, he released her. Too much pressure, perhaps, or illness. Did you hear she fainted during the children's concert? They say it's another man. No, they say it's the same man, returned from Paris with something to prove. When Margaret Hale read the morning edition of the Herald, her hands trembled ever so slightly. One column, written with venomous eloquence, concluded with a single devastating sentence. It would appear that not even the elegance of the Hale family can protect itself from the old disease, brother against brother. That evening she summoned Matthew to the conservatory. The plants had all been trimmed back for winter, and the room smelled of citrus and cold stone. She stood by the frost-rimmed windows, her gloved hands clasped behind her. "You orchestrated this," she said without turning. Matthew stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "No, Mother. I merely stood still long enough for the truth to come forward on its own." "You've shamed your brother," she said coldly, "and you've humiliated her. I have done neither. I've only existed, and if my existence causes this family discomfort, perhaps it is not as strong as we believed." She turned to face him then, eyes sharp. "You broke the balance." "No," he said quietly. "The balance was never real." She took a step closer. "Do not mistake Arianna's silence for consent. She is grateful to you, but she does not love you." He did not respond. His stillness was answer enough. When she left him there, Matthew remained, alone in the conservatory, watching the snow settle against the glass with the heaviness of a man who knew he could never go back to what had been. By week's end, the Hale household resembled a porcelain figurine cracked beneath the surface, still beautiful, still upright, but changed in ways no glue could mend. Matthew began packing quietly. His rooms, once temporary, now too heavy with memory, were stripped of all but the essentials. He informed the butler he would be leaving by Tuesday morning. Arianna found out only by chance, through a housemaid's murmur behind a half-closed door. That evening, she waited in the vestibule. The hall was dim, the gaslight flickering. She stood beneath the portrait of the late Mr. Hale, her coat draped over her arm. When Matthew descended the stairs, he stopped short at the sight of her. "You're leaving," she said. He nodded. "There's nothing more for me to stay for." She stepped closer, her voice barely audible. "And if I asked you to stay?" He stared at her, breath caught between disbelief and longing. "Why would you?" he asked, his voice rough with restraint. "You owe me nothing." "I know," she whispered, "but I'm tired of owing safety to men who don't see me." He closed the distance between them slowly, cautiously, not to touch, but to hear her, truly hear her. "I see you, Arianna," he said. Her eyes shimmered. "Then don't go. Not this time." The words fell between them like an oath. He exhaled, shaky, disarmed. "Then I won't." She nodded, and for the first time in days, her body softened, no longer braced against what might be taken from her. He did not reach for her hand, but the space between them seemed smaller now. No promises, no declarations, only a shared stillness, fragile and new. Upstairs, Margaret stood behind a veil of curtains, watching them in silence. Her face bore no trace of the fury from earlier, only a stillness that came from witnessing the end of one legacy and the beginning of another. That night, the bells of St. Thomas rang low across the frozen streets, echoing through glass and stone. Somewhere beyond the clamour of the city, past rumour and duty and the ache of failed expectations, two hearts began to beat in quiet, tentative rhythm, not loud enough to be heard by the world, but enough to be felt by one another. And sometimes, In a house built on honor and appearances, that was all that remained, and all that truly mattered. The city softened in the weeks that followed, as if winter itself had grown weary of its cruelty. Snow no longer fell with fury, but drifted lazily, like feathers from a shaken quilt. Icicles hung from eaves like glass fingers, and the Hudson glimmered beneath a delicate skin of frost. Inside parlors and drawing rooms, the glitter of the new year had faded into the muted hush of January's middle days. For Arianna and Matthew, life settled not into certainty, but into a quiet rhythm, tenuous, unspoken, and real. They did not begin with grand gestures. There were no declarations, no hands clasped in secret. Instead, there were Sunday mornings at St. Bartholomew's, where they sat side by side, but did not touch. There were slow walks through Central Park, where the trees stood bare and honest, stripped of pretense. They spoke of literature, of the children in her classroom, of the markets, of the weather, never of the past, and not yet of the future. Theirs was not a courtship, but a convalescence, a return to breath after too long underwater. Yet the city watched. It always did. Society had already decided what had happened, who had won, and who had been wronged. That Miss Whitfield, once destined for the respectable and mild-mannered James Hale, had instead cast her lot with the elder brother, the proud one, the prodigal one, was enough to fuel a dozen drawing-room murmurs. She heard it in the shift of conversation when she entered a room, in the sudden interest in her gloves or the shape of her hat. She read it in the eyes of women who once praised her composure, but now looked past her with gentle cruelty. Invitations, once routine, grew scarce. A musicale was rescheduled, a luncheon forgotten. Mrs. Langley sent a note suggesting Arianna take a quiet season for personal reflection. Still, Arianna did not retreat. She walked into shops with her chin lifted and replied to gossip with kindness. When a former friend greeted her with exaggerated surprise and said, "We had wondered if you'd left the city altogether," Arianna smiled and answered, "I never leave what I love, only what no longer welcomes me." She returned to her classroom with renewed focus, finding in the children's laughter a refuge against the judgment of the adult world. They did not care for scandal. They cared that she remembered their birthdays, that she praised their drawings, that her presence brought calm. Matthew, too, faced quiet resistance. He was no longer whispered about as a disappointment. He was now viewed as a disruption. Clients hesitated. Partners watched him closely at the bank. Some subtly distanced themselves, afraid to be caught in the fallout of family tension. But he did not fight it. He had fought so many things in his life, expectation, shame, silence, and he was tired of battle. He chose instead to work, to be present, to endure, and he chose to remain near Arianna. He met her at the schoolhouse once each week with a small gift, a bundle of kindling, a sack of apples, a few fresh pencils for the children. She never asked for these offerings, and he never lingered after giving them. It was enough to leave behind something useful. It was enough to be allowed near. One Thursday afternoon, they visited the public library together. Arianna had suggested they look at the French botanical prints recently donated, and Matthew, who once thought he had no interest in such things, found himself absorbed in the delicate detail of a water lily, its petals tinged with the faintest blue. As they stood in quiet admiration of the exhibit, a gentle voice interrupted. "Mr. Hale?" They both turned. The young woman who stood before them was of slight build, with hair the color of honeyed wheat gathered at the nape of her neck. Her dress was modest but well cut, in a dusky lilac shade that brought out the quiet intelligence in her pale blue eyes. "Miss Rivington," Matthew said warmly. Arianna remained still, observing the woman without a trace of jealousy, only curiosity. "Forgive me," Miss Rivington said, her voice low, thoughtful. "I did not wish to interrupt." "Not at all," Matthew replied. "Miss Whitfield, may I introduce Miss Eleanor Rivington? Her family once lived near us in Gramercy Park. Miss Rivington is a pianist, quite accomplished." Eleanor blushed slightly. "Not nearly as accomplished as rumours insist." Arianna extended her hand. "It's a pleasure." Eleanor smiled. "I've heard your name often in the libraries. Your students borrow more books than most grown men." "Then I must be doing something right," Arianna said gently. The three exchanged a few more words before Eleanor excused herself to find a new volume of Chopin's works. As she walked away, James appeared from around a corner. He looked tired but composed, holding a stack of books beneath one arm. He stopped short upon seeing them, and for a moment the silence swelled. Then he inclined his head politely. "Miss Whitfield, brother." "James," Matthew returned evenly. Arianna's voice was soft. "Good afternoon." James looked past them toward the direction Eleanor had gone. "You've met Miss Rivington, I see." "Yes," Matthew said. "She speaks highly of you." James gave a faint smile, one laced with something unreadable. "We've spoken often here. She's quiet company, easy to be near." Arianna's heart stirred, not with regret, but with recognition. James had never asked for attention. Perhaps now he was finding someone who would see him without needing to be rescued or admired. "I'm glad," she said simply. James looked at her then, for the first time in what felt like weeks, and in his eyes there was no anger, no accusation, only release. He bowed slightly and walked away. Arianna and Matthew lingered a few more minutes in the library, but the atmosphere had shifted. When they stepped outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Matthew offered her his arm. "Would you care for a walk?" She hesitated, then nodded. They strolled through Union Square, where the statues stood solemn and pigeons gathered on the iron fences. The cold had returned, biting at their cheeks, but neither seemed to mind. "Miss Rivington is kind," Arianna said eventually. "She is," Matthew agreed. "And gentle." "Yes. She will not demand what others cannot give." He looked at her then, his eyes searching. "Do you mean James?" he asked. "I mean all of us," she said softly. "We each carry our wounds differently." He said nothing for a while, then, "You have become quieter." "I'm learning to listen," she replied. "To myself, to what I need." "And what is it you need, Arianna?" Her eyes met his. The city moved around them, people passing, carriages rumbling, but in that instant it all seemed far away. "I don't yet know," she said, "but I no longer fear the question." He nodded, and they walked on, neither of them reaching for the other's hand, but walking close enough that their sleeves brushed now and then, like the whisper of a promise not yet made. Above them, the clouds began to gather again, heavy with something unsaid, but for now, there was stillness. Not the calm before a storm, but the silence between them. And in that silence, something fragile, something quietly radiant began to grow. The parlour had been arranged with the precision of a diplomatic reception, though it was meant only for family. Candles flickered in every silver sconce, their golden light warming the walls of the Hale townhouse with an intimacy that was both intentional and reluctant. Outside, the city pressed close in winter silence. It was the evening of Twelfth Night, the final echo of the season's joy, and with it came the quiet reckoning of all things left unsaid. Arianna stood by the window, her gloved hands folded before her, watching as the last carriage rolled away from the curb. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and constant, as though the heavens themselves wished to cleanse what had been bruised. She wore a gown of navy silk, high-necked and modest, but cut to flatter her slender frame. Her dark hair had been coiled in a simple chignon, held in place by her mother's favourite ivory comb. There was dignity in her stillness, and solitude too, until the door opened behind her. Margaret Hale stepped inside alone. She did not speak at first. Her gown rustled faintly as she moved across the rug, its fabric a deep shade of emerald, rarely worn by women of her age, but which suited her proud bearing. She stood across from Arianna, not beside her, and when she finally spoke, her voice was clear and deliberate. "I ask that the others give us a moment." Arianna turned, her expression unreadable. "Of course. I have been unkind," Margaret said, "and unfair. I have judged you by whispers and circumstance, rather than by your actions." There was a pause, the kind of pause in which years settle between two women. "I cannot say I would have acted differently if our positions were reversed," Arianna replied carefully. "But I thank you for saying it now. I do not offer this because it is fashionable to forgive," Margaret continued. "I offer it because I was wrong, and because I see now what you have done, how you have carried shame that was not yours and turned it into grace. My son was not ruined by you. He was returned to us by the woman you are." The words struck deeper than either expected. Arianna lowered her gaze, her throat tightening. Margaret moved forward slowly and extended her hand. "You are welcome in this home, not as James's former fiancé, not even as Matthew's." She stopped, breathing. "As yourself." Arianna took the offered hand. Their fingers met. One trembled, the other steadied, and in that contact passed a silent reconciliation, forged not in sentiment, but in the weight of truth shared. Moments later, they rejoined the others in the drawing room, where the fire crackled and the last cups of tea had grown tepid. James stood beside the mantel, a book unopened in his hand. He glanced up when they entered, reading the air with the ease of a man who had spent his life navigating subtle storms. He crossed to Arianna and bowed slightly, as if greeting a guest. "You look well," he said gently. "I am," she replied, her voice calm. He hesitated, then spoke so only she and Matthew could hear. "I once thought I knew what love looked like. I believed it to be quiet, safe, and linear. But perhaps I mistook gratitude for affection." Arianna's heart contracted. There was no bitterness in his tone, only understanding. "You were never unkind," she said, "and neither were you," he answered. Then he added with a faint, wistful smile, "I hope you'll both forgive me if I say I am relieved not to have married someone who belongs to the city more than to me." Matthew, standing a pace behind her, inclined his head. "I never meant to steal what was not mine." "You didn't," James replied. "You simply recognized it first." Later that evening, as the guests filtered out and the fire sank into embers, a letter was delivered. Arianna recognized her father's handwriting at once, measured, precise, and aged. She opened the envelope quietly, alone in a corner of the room, while Matthew lingered at the threshold, unwilling to intrude. The letter was addressed not to her, but to the Hales, to the family who once welcomed my daughter, then hesitated, and now chooses to stand beside her, it began. "I offer no defense for the disgrace I brought upon her. I offer instead my gratitude for the woman she became in spite of me." The letter praised Arianna's unflinching loyalty, her tireless devotion to her pupils, and the quiet way she had shouldered his debts until the final note had been paid. "You may see a former scandal in her," he wrote, "but I see the only thing I have done in this world worth redeeming." By the end of the letter, Margaret's eyes had filled with tears again. James placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "And Matthew?" He slipped out into the hall, silent. He waited there until he heard her footsteps approach behind him. She did not speak, only looked at him with eyes rimmed in emotion, her fingers still clutching the folded paper. "I didn't know he'd written it," Matthew said softly. "I believe you. I had something I wished to give you," he continued, reaching into the inside pocket of his coat. He withdrew a thin box, plain, dark velvet, and held it between them. She did not take it. "This is not a proposal," he added quickly, "not in the way society expects. There is no fanfare, no audience." "Then what is it?" "A promise," his voice deepened, "that if you choose to walk beside me, I will not ask you to change. I will not seek to rescue you or soften you or turn you into someone more acceptable to the world." She stared at him. "This is a ring," he said, "but it is not a prize. It is the emblem of something quieter. I want your voice in my home, your hand in my work, your mind at my side, not a performance but a life." He opened the box. Inside was a simple gold band, delicately etched with a vine motif. At the center was not a diamond, but a small, polished sapphire, deep blue, like her mother's favorite gown. Arianna's breath caught. "You came to my school to fix a desk," she whispered. "I came because I could not stay away. I asked you not to go. You are the first person who ever asked me to stay." She looked down at the ring. Her throat closed, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then she reached out and with trembling fingers took it. "I accept," she said, her voice breaking, "not because I need to be saved, but because with you I am not ashamed to be seen." Matthew, who had stood through storms, through exile and humiliation, closed his hand around hers with reverence. That night, no announcement was made. No news spread across the city. But in a quiet schoolhouse office, where chalk dust lingered on the air and books leaned tiredly against each other on the shelves, a woman who had survived scandal and solitude said yes. Not to a future of perfection, but to a future that would be built day by day in truth. And beside her stood a man who had finally learned that grace was not something earned through brilliance or wealth, but by choosing to remain when others fled. The snow fell with the quiet insistence of memory, covering the narrow streets of Gramercy Park in a soft, white hush. It was not a storm, nor a flurry, but the kind of snowfall that felt deliberate, like a benediction whispered from the heavens. Inside the modest stone church tucked between two old townhouses, warmth radiated from brass sconces and candlelight glinting off the stained glass windows. No fanfare, no choir, no mass of society gowns rustling in pews. Only a few rows of familiar faces, some solemn, some smiling, all bearing witness to something rare, a union born not of strategy, rescue, or scandal's aftermath, but of love that had endured its proving. Arianna stood in the vestibule, her hands clasped before her, the fabric of her mother's ivory gown cascading around her in gentle folds. It had been let out at the waist and hemmed with new lace at the cuffs, but its soul remained unchanged. Her dark hair was pinned in soft waves, adorned by a single pearl comb. There was no veil. She had nothing to hide. Margaret approached from behind and adjusted the sleeve of her bodice with fingers that trembled more than she wished to admit. "She wore this when she came to your father's concert at the conservatory," Margaret murmured. "Everyone said she looked like spring had walked into the room." Arianna turned, her voice hushed. "I only remember how she smelled of violets and starch." "She was brave," Margaret said. "So are you." No more words were exchanged, none were needed. The music inside had already begun, a single violin, played by one of Arianna's students, Eleanor Rivington's younger brother. Arianna stepped into the aisle, not as a bride presented, but as a woman walking toward her own future. Matthew waited near the altar, his hands folded before him, his expression still and reverent. He wore no boutonniere, no embroidered waistcoat, just a well-fitted dark suit, clean linen, and a silver watch passed down from his grandfather. His eyes never left hers, not when she entered, not when the music swelled, not when every guest rose in silent homage. To see them together was not to witness spectacle, but to glimpse something hard-won. Their hands met at the base of the altar, and neither wept, not out of restraint, but because both had already shed the necessary tears in earlier chapters of their lives. The ceremony was brief. The minister, an old friend of the schoolhouse, spoke plainly of covenant, endurance, and daily choice. He mentioned nothing of class or society, but rather the soft work of companionship, lifting burdens, preserving silence, speaking truth when it is unwelcome, and remaining through winter. When the time came, Matthew slid the ring onto Arianna's finger with steady hands. It was the same vine-etched gold band, its sapphire catching the morning light that filtered through the chapel glass. And when she placed his ring, their hands lingered, nothing grand, nothing theatrical, just the quiet ache of two souls anchoring one another. The benediction fell over them like a hush, and then they were married. As they turned to face the small gathering, James met Arianna's gaze from the first pew. He smiled, not with the forced composure of a man pretending to feel less, but with the gentleness of someone who had begun to heal. After the ceremony, in the small courtyard dusted with snow, guests offered modest congratulations. No opera singers, no champagne towers, just warm cider, wool coats, and the scent of cinnamon rising from a copper pot by the fire grate. Eleanor Rivington stood beside James beneath a holly wreath. Her gloved hand brushed his as they reached for the same cup. For a moment, they did not speak. Then she said, so softly that no one else could hear, "I used to come here with my mother. She believed quiet places held the loudest hopes." James looked down at her. "Do you?" "I do now." He offered her the cup. Their fingers touched again, chaste but intimate. Margaret stood apart, her kerchief pressed to her lips as she wept silently. Whether for her son, her late friend, or the daughter-in-law she had once rejected, no one could say. Later that afternoon, the final scene unfolded not in drawing rooms or carriages, but back at the place where it had all begun. The schoolhouse stood dignified and humble, its new wing freshly painted in pale blue-grey. A small plaque gleamed in the winter light. Beneath it, engraved in quiet script, "In honor of Eleanor Whitfield, for the lessons that outlast us." The children gathered in coats and mittens, their cheeks pink from the cold. Arianna stood among them, no longer a figure of gossip or charity, but of permanence. Her name was no longer whispered in scandal, but spoken with pride. Matthew remained in the background, his hands in his pockets, watching as she untied the ceremonial ribbon with one of the youngest pupils by her side. He had insisted that the donation be anonymous, but of course, no one was truly fooled. When she turned to look at him, her expression held no triumph, only serenity. That evening, the city turned inward once more. Snow continued to fall, blanketing the sounds of carriages, muffling the bells of distant chapels, softening the edges of sharp memory. In their modest home, barely larger than her former schoolroom, Arianna laid aside her gloves and removed the pearl comb from her hair. Matthew lit the lamp, then crossed to her, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. He said nothing. She leaned into him, not for rescue, not from need, but because this too was a choice, not once, but always. The world outside was changing. Buildings climbed higher, automobiles stirred curiosity, society's taste moved on to newer names, newer scandals. But in the quiet steadiness of their rooms, Matthew and Arianna chose again and again to remain. Not for appearances, not for penance, but because some love does not arrive in triumph or spectacle. It arrives in the snow, in the silence, in the spaces between, and it endures. The winter of 1906 came early to New York, settling over the city like an old, familiar shawl. The chimneys smoked steadily, children skated in the half-frozen fountains of Gramercy Park, and the streets below Madison Avenue echoed with the rhythmic clip of carriage wheels and the distant hum of change. Automobiles, electricity, women's suffrage murmurs, gaining courage in drawing rooms once silent on such matters. At the edge of the East Side, in a modest red brick house with a slate roof and ivy clinging to the walls, a fire crackled inside a parlor lined with books, drawings, and the soft laughter of children. Arianna knelt beside a small girl in a velvet pinafore, tying a ribbon into her braid. The girl, Clara, wrinkled her nose. "It's crooked, Mama." "Then it's yours," Arianna replied with a soft smile, pressing a kiss to her daughter's cheek. Clara dashed toward the front window, where her brother stood on tiptoe watching for his father. Jacob, older by 2 years, had inherited Matthew's quiet eyes and Arianna's stubborn chin. He held a paper booklet under his arm, his first published essay in the school newsletter. "Papa's home!" he cried, voice bright. The door opened moments later, and in swept Matthew, snow dusting his coat and scarf. He shook the cold from his shoulders, leaned down to scoop Clara into his arms, and pressed a kiss to Arianna's temple with the comfort of long companionship. "Someone's been watching the clock," he teased, nodding toward Jacob. "Someone's been waiting to show you page 3, Arianna said, lifting an eyebrow. Matthew ruffled his son's hair, took the newsletter, and sat beside the fire to read it aloud. His voice warm, his pride unmasked. The children leaned in. Arianna rested on the arm of the chair, one hand on his shoulder, the other cupping a cup of tea gone lukewarm. The scene was ordinary, but within its quiet lived everything they had once feared they would never have. Outside, the city had changed. The schoolhouse now had 3 wings. Women were applying not just for teaching posts, but administrative ones. Margaret Hale, once feared for her tongue, had become an unlikely benefactress for young women's education, her name printed discreetly in the corner of scholarship announcements. Age had softened her, but it was Eleanor Rivington who had tempered her. Eleanor and James, now married 2 years, had no children, but filled their home with music. Their parlour had become a haven for the daughters of bankrupt families and the sons of widowed clerks, young people seeking lessons in dignity as much as piano scales. Eleanor taught them all without condescension. James greeted each with quiet kindness, though his eyes still bore the weight of a past, surrendered with grace. Not every thread was tied with ribbon. The world had forgotten Arianna's father, despite the letter he had once written. He lived quietly in Boston now, rarely travelling, rarely seen. His absence was not bitter, it was chosen. He wrote often, but Arianna responded only occasionally. Some wounds, even healed, do not ache for reopening. And Matthew, he had been offered 3 major posts in the last decade, at banks, at consultancies, even a foreign trade mission. He declined them all, not for lack of ambition, but for clarity. "I've been away long enough," he had said once. "I will not miss another winter, another ribbon in Clara's hair, another essay in Jacob's hand." At night, when the children were asleep and the house quiet, Matthew and Arianna would sit by the window in the parlour, side by side, their chairs angled slightly inward. No need for conversation. Their story had already been told. They spoke through shared glances, small touches, and silences that had long since stopped being empty. Once during such an evening, Arianna turned to him and asked almost absently, "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you'd never come home that Christmas Eve?" Matthew looked out the frosted glass, watching a couple pass beneath the street lamp, young, laughing, hopeful. "No," he said softly, "because the man who stayed in Paris would never have deserved this." She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of years. "And the girl who once cared too much about what others thought would never have had the courage to say yes." The room filled with quiet again. Snow fell heavier now, blanketing the iron fences, the bare tree limbs, the paths to churches where once, years ago, a woman had stood at candlelight and discovered that time did not erase love. It refined it. Their story was not one of grandeur. No portraits hung in museums. No ballads were sung. But 6 winters later, in a modest house with warm light in the windows, Arianna and Matthew Hale lived a truth far rarer than fame. They had chosen each other, and they had never stopped. Some love stories are written in fire, others in ice. But the one you've just witnessed was written in snow, soft, quiet, persistent. Arianna and Matthew's journey reminds us that love doesn't always arrive wrapped in perfection or timing, but in the quiet, daily acts of choosing one another, even after the world has given up. It is a story about grace, about rebuilding, about the courage to face not only society's judgment, but one's own fears. And perhaps more than anything, it is a story about the kind of love that doesn't need to be loud to endure. It just needs to be real. If their story moved you, we'd love to know. Leave a comment and tell us what stayed with you the most. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word endure in the comments. That way, we'll know you were with us every step of the way, through heartbreak, through silence, and into the snow-covered dawn of something new. If you feel inspired and wish to support the team behind these timeless stories, you can now send a super thanks right here on YouTube. Whether it's a little or a lot, your kindness helps us keep these tales alive. And if a donation isn't possible right now, sharing this video with someone who loves historical romance as much as you do is another beautiful way to help. And if you want more stories like this, emotional, elegant, unforgettable, don't forget to check the video cards we've left for you at the end of this episode. Each one holds a new beginning, waiting just for you. Thank you for letting us be part of your world today.